the road.
Let's do it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for leadership styles that may derail your career. Are you at risk? Thank you so much for joining us. If there are any scheduling conflicts that have come up for you this morning, not to worry, we'll be sending a recording of this webinar out, and you can always find it on our website under the On the Airwaves section, along with a lot of other great resources, videos, and past webinars. My name is Kenzie Bertrand, and I'm the Manager of Programs here at the Roundtable. We at the Roundtable are committed to making an impact. As part of our own commitment to ongoing reconciliation, in January 2022, we partnered with Inspire. Inspire is a national Indigenous registered charity that invests in the education of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people for the long-term benefit of these individuals, their families, and communities in Canada. The awful discovery of 215 Indigenous children buried in unmarked graves in Kamloops, BC in 2021 deeply affected us. To honor the legacy of the Kamloops 215, we are striving to provide 215 university scholarships over the next 5 years. If you'd like to learn more or make a donation to help us achieve our goal, please reach out to Claudia, our marketing manager, at the email you are seeing on the screen. As we reaffirm our dedication to supporting Indigenous communities, we want to acknowledge the land we reside on as it recognizes the connection Indigenous peoples have with their territories and shows respect for their history and culture. I will now say the land acknowledgement for where I am residing. I respectfully acknowledge that in Toronto, we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's webinar, so you'll receive an email with a link to the recording, and we'll also release a summary blog post that we encourage you to check out on our website under the resources section. I'll drop a link in the chat soon. And with that, I want to officially open the chat and hear from you. Feel free to introduce yourself, tell us where you work at, or what brought you here. We have many interesting people joining us today who could become valuable connections in your network, so don't be shy to add your thoughts there. We love an interactive crowd. And finally, the Q&A will be open and we'll be monitoring questions that come through. No need to wait until the end of the session to ask these questions. Please put them in the Q&A as soon as you think of them, and we'll answer them and keep the questions coming. For those of us who are new to us, we're the Roundtable, a company that helps leaders navigate change, disruption, growth, and by building the mindsets and behaviors that matter most. So I'd like to introduce you to Glain Roberts-McCabe. Glain is the founder and president of the Roundtable. Glain is a certified executive coach and has over 30 years experience leading teams in private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. Glain is the creator of several multi-award-winning group coaching programs, including the Roundtable for Leaders, the Roundtable Catalyst, and the Roundtable High Performance Team Coach, and is the author of 2 best-selling books, The Grassroots Leadership Revolution and Did I Really Sign Up for This? Glain, over to you.
Thanks, Kenzie. And everybody give Kenzie some love because she is stepping in and stunt doubling for her colleague, Claudia, today, who is spending time with her mom, who is up visiting from Ecuador. So great job, Kenzie. Thank you for getting us set up. Well, welcome, everyone. And I know we've got a few new folks on the call, so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and tell you just a little bit about the work we do here at the Roundtable in case you're unfamiliar with it. I kind of think in the space of leadership development, when we talk about leadership development, we get the first call, which is we need leadership training or we need somebody to get a coach. And it's such a shallow conversation, right? Like it's usually going way deeper than that. We need to go deeper. And so, at the Roundtable, when we kind of dig deeper, what we find out is people are saying, hey, we need to have exceptional leaders, exceptional teams, exceptional culture. That's kind of not deep enough either, because these things don't work in isolation, right? Leaders drive culture, leaders impact teams, teams impact culture. So there's a lot of interconnectedness. So at the Roundtable, our view is, hey, we've got to, get these pieces together. And what we're trying to do actually is unleash collective impact. So that's what we've done. We've created a number of programs and systems that actually work together to help create more connectivity and drive stronger results over a longer period of time within organizations. So if you're interested in kind of learning more, please connect with us. If I put it in layman's terms, we do one-on-one coaching, we do group coaching, and we do team coaching. So we'd always love to kind of hear from you if you're interested. So let me tell you about our guest today, because that's really why you're here. We're here to talk about these 4 leadership styles that may derail your career. And I'm very excited. I'm going to stop sharing so I can bring up my special guest, Drew Rand. That's how I call him. Andrew, Drew.
Got it.
What do you prefer? I think the doctor
Drew is perfect, Lauren. I
I'm
appreciate it.
thinking about that today because Drew is he's a IO psychologist, one of these very deep thinkers. And I was going to introduce you as Dr. Drew, and then I realized that that guy, he's kind of gone off the rails, hasn't he? So
Yeah, it's not the
want to go there.
best connection.
Anyway, for everybody, Drew is one of our partners. He has been a member of our longtime research partner and assessment partner management research group, has spent many, many years doing what I've done, digging into leadership, working with leaders across sectors, across industries, across levels. And I'm super excited for this conversation today, Drew. I think it's going to be a juicy one.
Me too. We'll have fun for sure.
Yeah.
If the pre-call is any indication, we'll have a lot of fun.
The pre-call, we ran out of time into all kinds of interesting things. Okay, so before we kind of jump into it, why don't you tell us a little bit about what are you working on that's exciting you these days?
Yeah, sure. So at MRG we do I work at MRG. I also have my own private practice, so I'll talk about both really quick. At MRG we do a couple of things that I really love, and one of them we'll be talking about today is we just do a lot of research at MRG, right? The nice thing about MRG is we just have so much data through the work that we do that we have just a lot of opportunity to do research in many different areas, right? So Maria is our head of research at MRG, and Maria and I poke around and stuff all the time, which is just really fun. And depending on whatever it is we're looking at, men, women, some in this industry over here, I'm curious what happens in Germany, whatever it might be. It's just really fun to be able to have all that data available to you and just really understand leadership from a behavioral point of view, which is really what MRG hones in on. I also have my own private practice, which is just straight consulting, and I will tell you, I've been doing it for a couple of years. I've loved it, and my intention for 2025 is to be more intentional about it instead of reactive. And I'm excited about the prospect of being a little more intentional about what I actually want that consulting part of my life to be. So best intentions that I will do that, but as being a consultant, sometimes we get a little too reactive at times, I think.
Well, it's hard when there's so many interesting things out there that you can jump into. So I can completely understand that. But that word intentional, those that have been around the roundtable, we like that word. It's the core of our leadership model. You got to be intentional, right?
Yes,
in terms of how
sure.
you want to show up.
Yep.
All right, so let's get into this. As you said, MRG, 40 years in business, global research powerhouse. And, one of the things that, you've done a lot of looking at is typical behaviors that will trip people up. And you've got 4. I think I called it the favorite 4.
Yeah.
Why don't you give us an overview of each of them to get us started on this conversation?
Yeah, sure. So this is research that we did a couple of years ago, just looking at what trips people up, what are kind of derailers, right? And at MRG, we're lucky we have, again, the behaviors, but then we also have these outcome measures, and essentially we're just looking at if you demonstrate these behaviors, what happens to the outcome measures, right? And we came up with sort of 4 I'm going to call them like themes almost, I think is the best way of putting it, that lead to outcomes is the best way I think of putting it. And the first one we termed My Way or the Highway, right? And the set of there's a too much of this and too little of that. And I think the too much in the My Way or the Highway is a degree of really self-centeredness, right? A sort of inflexibility with someone's thinking about bringing other people into the conversation, and then on top of that, being really sort of assertive or almost potentially even aggressive with your own kind of your own opinions, your own behavior, and just not making space for anyone. And when I say space, I mean like space for people to provide an opinion, space by asking questions, space by supporting other people or being accommodative in some way. It really is this that it's really just about me, right? And I have the best idea, and we're gonna do what I say, right? And so it's just this really self-centeredness is really the best way that I can describe it, Glenn. And I think that's on top of it, it very often is coupled with extreme expectations that are a little out of whack, right? Like the bar is held almost too high in some way, and if it doesn't go well, it's not my fault, it's your fault. And so yeah, sort of the cocktail there just turns into a um, not a great set of behaviors or good outcomes is the first one
So
there.
as I think about this, I always think about, sometimes when we look at celebrities or public figures, is there any public figure out there leadership wise that you would say sort of led with this my way or the highway to give us all an image of what that looks like in real life?
So this is totally unfair of me. I had a conversation a couple of years ago with an individual. So you're just reminding me of this now, who was convinced that Steve Jobs was an amazing leader.
Right. That's who came to my
And
mind, actually.
yeah, and I was like, I don't know about that.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I'm gonna have to take issue with that, right? And was he a brilliant individual? 100%, no question
yeah,
at all.
yeah,
Was he a phenomenal leader? I don't think so, right?
yeah,
Based on what I know, right?
yeah,
Based upon the people I've talked to who were in that world and so on and so forth. Um, he would have demonstrated this style quite a bit, right?
yeah, 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 yeah,
He was lucky that he was wildly intelligent and had really good ideas,
yeah.
right? But I think that was an anomaly or unique in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I remember hearing Bob Sutton talk. He wrote the book, The No Asshole Rule. And excuse me, everybody, for using that word, but that's what the book is called. And he said, one of the things he says in the book actually is if you Google Steve Jobs is an a-hole, you would get more hits than anything. So I
Yes.
haven't done that lately. I remember I did do it at the time just to check it out, and he was not wrong. So yeah, and I think when you choose to work for a leader like that, there's probably some payoff you're getting because they're so visionary and they're so forward thinking, and there's probably a cost and a trade-off that if you're the follower of somebody like that you're going to be suffering from, and not everybody's got that special sauce that Steve Jobs had, which just sort of leaves you with the
Yes.
the less than appealing parts of that particular profile. Okay, let's move on. What's the next one? What's the second one?
Yeah, so the next one in some ways is the opposite. So the
Mm.
next one is what we describe the happy follower.
Ah,
So it's the person who is almost unwilling to share their opinion, or is too almost too nice in some ways,
mm,
and don't bring their sort of their own intelligence, their own ideas, or this willingness to potentially challenge to the table. And yes, they might be lovely and a lovely person and great at taking care of people, but in terms of delivering results, right, moving things forward, it's they have trouble with that, right? They have trouble with that, and they also have, I think one of the other big things within this theme is just this avoidance of conflict, right, and not
right.
being willing to have the challenging conversation when it needs to happen. And what I people in this category often say, it's like, time will take care of it. It's like, I know time won't take care of it. It actually will be a lot worse in 30 days if you don't, right, if you don't talk about it now or deal with it now. And so this really just encapsulates this happy follower. And then again, being unwilling to potentially challenge those that are above them, right? Even if they think it's a bad idea or why are we doing that exactly? Just not voicing their opinion.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because one of the speakers we had earlier in the year, my friend Nate Regier, he wrote a book called Compassionate Accountability. And we've been having a lot of those conversations lately in organizations. And it is interesting. Some organizations are just really, really nice. And the leadership leans very heavily towards that very, very nice. And then if they get a shift in CEO or they're starting to move the productivity needle, it really can be tricky. And I often have the conversation, okay, but there's nice and there's being kind, right? It's not nice to let somebody continue to underperform and not give them the feedback and not help them get to where they need to go. Part of our
Totally.
job as leaders is to have the courage to be kind and help them grow and improve, right? Versus that avoidance, they'll figure it all out.
So I work, I've got a client, decent sized client, and they about 1,500 people, and they just purchased a couple years ago a much smaller firm. The bigger firm of what you just described, so kind, so like to a fault. Like, oh,
Yeah,
you didn't get your time card in? Don't worry about it. No,
yeah,
no
yeah, yeah.
problem. Like, we'll still pay you. And they've purchased a smaller firm that is the exact opposite. And luckily, this merger it's been so healthy for them.
Mm.
It's almost like they recognized that they needed it, and the sort of the candor that came along with purchasing this small organization has been really, really good for them.
Yeah,
And no, the world did not melt when
yeah, yeah,
people had to get their time cards in on time.
yeah, yeah. You need the balance, right? Okay, the third one. What do we got next?
Yeah, third one is we termed it stick to the rules. So
Mm.
this is the type of leader who is unwilling to go outside of the bounds of two and a half particular things, I think. One is just what are the rules and the procedures say? And be unwilling to consider, I think, situational circumstance that would take you outside of the bounds of whatever the rules, the procedures are. It's like, no, 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 policy is this. We can't do it any other way, even though the situation clearly is calling for potentially a different decision, behavior, action, whatever it might be. And then the on top of that, it's being too deferential, right? It's being too deferential to the rules, but then also too deferential to those that would be in authority positions.
Yeah, yeah.
And so sort of being a yes person in some way with, again, well, it's the authority. They said that this is what we're supposed to do. Again, without thinking about what the situation is or being willing to challenge, right? So it's this just really, really tight bounds around the guardrails that are provided by the policies and the procedures. It happens in some organizations more than others, depending on what kind of industry you're in, so on and so forth. But it can be really limiting, right? It really can limit your thinking or your ability to kind of bring your expertise or intelligence to the fore. And then things also, it keeps the status quo. It keeps the status quo, and that might not be the healthiest thing.
Yeah, and I think that kind of thinking, I mean, I'm thinking about some environments where that sort of follow the rules. Like if you're in a high risk environment, you're in something that you really need to be very policies driven. Like we have a couple of clients that they
Sure.
do things that literally, if something went wrong, it probably would be life and death.
Yes.
And that side of it, and you can see people who have that wiring to be very diligent about following the rules and procedures, where that could be an asset. What I see though with those organizations and the cultures is when it comes to developing people, when it comes to that other side of the equation, they really struggle with that. Coaching, for example, which is fairly, kind of it's a looser approach than a command and control, follow this, do that type approach. You often see cultures almost wrestle with that, where we need you to be thinking this way. And so we hire people that do this way, but then we want them to be more coach-like, which is quite different, right?
Totally. And yeah, the thing that I'm thinking of another client I worked with, it's an engineering firm. And
Yeah,
yes, there is a best way to build a bridge. I get it, right? Like,
you got to get it
follow
right.
the rules there. Like, follow
Yeah,
the rules
yeah,
when you're
yeah,
building the bridge. But within the aspect of building the bridge, it's not just about building the bridge,
yeah,
right? It's about managing the client. There's a lot of processes in the middle, so on and so forth, where there's a lot more flexibility and leeway in terms
yeah.
of how you might get it done or how decisions might be made. And even within that, they get too tightly wound or bound with sort of like, no, well, no, this is how we've done it for 78 years. It's like,
Mm.
I mean, I think there could be some process improvement here, is my guess,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. It also makes me think too, like honestly, this is where, organizations can get into trouble because they promote technical competence over the leadership capability, and probably need to think about different roles for different things, right? So there's also that's sort of going through my mind. Okay, what's the fourth one? What do we got?
Yeah, the fourth one is what we called the engaging lightweight. And what we mean by engaging is a person who is lovely and charismatic. Everyone likes them. They're very outgoing. They seem to be able to move in and out of social situations with ease. There's no stiltedness to them. Um, but then at the end of the day, translating what they're talking about or their ideas into actual action or execution doesn't ever happen, right? So
Mm.
yes, they are engaging. Like, totally love that person. What did they get done in the past 6 months? No idea. No idea what they got done. And so the lightweight part is this either unwillingness or lack of desire to kind of follow through almost
Mm.
in some way. And I find that these people are they're really good at finding places to hide
Oh.
in within organizations. And yes, they sort of maneuver in and out of things quite well, but in terms of like gritting your teeth and getting the thing done, that's where they struggle. And eventually it sort of gets uncovered, right? That they're not actually producing in any way, I think is the best way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they're probably quite good at managing up, I would think.
100. Oh
That's
yeah. No,
probably
these
one
people,
of the
yes. 100%.
qualities.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So those are some of the kind of behavioral pieces that can really trip us up, right? In
Sure.
terms of things. But when I think about career and folks, like if you got questions about any of these four profiles, do you want to recap just the headlines again? There was the My Way and My Way or the
Yeah. So
Highway.
my way or the highway, the happy follower, sticking to the rules, and then the engaging lightweight.
The engaging lightweight. I love that one.
Yeah.
The engaging lightweight. If you got questions about any of these, start throwing them in the chat in the Q&A. Okay, so our behaviors will derail us. It's a kind of a really kind of obvious one that, we see. I always say to, our clients, it's like, you get hired for what they need you to do. You're going to get fired for how you go about doing it. Like you're always being measured on both sides of that balance sheet all the time, whether people are telling you that or not. And the tricky thing on the behavioral side, which is why we love the MRG tools, because they're all about getting at those behaviors, is that often people don't know how to tell you what you're doing that's tripping you up, and so they'll work around you, or you get labeled as being that person, right? So critical that we really understand the impact of our behaviors on others. But let's talk about some of the other things that can really get in our way, because let's say I know our group, and I would guess that they're all listening to those and going, yeah, don't relate to any of those, but maybe there's somebody in my team or there's somebody in my organization that I see demonstrating these behaviors. Let's talk about some of the other things that can throw our careers off balance, though.
Sure.
One of the things that you and I talked about in the pre-survey that I thought was quite intriguing was this idea of when people are on the way up the ladder, what they underestimate, right? The shifts that they underestimate that they need to pay more attention to. I want to share that.
So I think so the simplest way I can put it is what I find is that people hit a point where they underestimate themselves.
Mm,
And so it's really interesting. Earlier in careers, things I think I don't know if it's youth, um, or your world is smaller or whatever it might be, but it feels, I think people make bigger moves. Maybe you have less accountability in your life, so you have the freedom to do it. Or well, I don't have to, I'm not tied over here. And so I think things feel less risky when you're really earlier in your career. But as things move forward, I think things start to feel heavier or riskier in some way. And on top of it, what I often find, and I know that we talked about this in the pre-call, I find this is anecdotal, but I find this actually more with women than I do with men, is this um, is this belief that they don't have it yet. Like, no, I don't have the skill yet, or I'm not there, I'm not ready.
Yeah.
And well, the time's not right. And my question is, I don't why is that storyline there for you? Right? It's just not having this confidence that they can do it or that they're ready for whatever reason. And I think on top of this, they also very often have this belief or this mindset that the people above them like have it all together. Right?
Hmm.
That it's like, oh, they really know what they're doing, and they almost like hold them on a pedestal. It's like, well, I'm not that person, so like I can't do that job.
Yeah.
And so they sort of they don't apply for promotions. They don't think they're ready to take over this project or this team lead thing, whatever it might be. And they really can slow career growth
Yeah.
because in my experience personally, but also coaching people, the most growth always happens when you sort of like close your eyes and take a step over, like, I don't really know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But you make it work. But you
Yeah. Yeah.
make
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and that's where like that's in what I see really big growth happening. And again, I see this storyline more with women than I do with men for whatever reason. I'm always encouraging people, no, I think you should try, right?
Yeah.
And I think you'll be surprised at how much uh, how much you will be able to figure it out, how
Yeah.
much you
Yeah.
figure it out.
Well, you know what, I have people that follow me know we drop these leadership truths, and one of my leadership truths was your comfort zone is a career killer. Because if you're sitting in your comfort zone, and I think to your point, what I observe is, when you're early on in your career, to your point, you take more risks. But sometimes people have a set point in their mind, right? I want to become a director, or I want to be an AVP, or I want to be a VP, right? And if you've kind of got that set point, then when you achieve that, it's an interesting thing that starts to happen where when you were in your career taking risks, pushing the envelope to get to that point, then it shifts. And then all of a sudden it's about holding on to that point. It's holding on to that position. It's keeping close to that. And you reduce, the risk taking. You're really a lot more cautious around trying these things. And sometimes stage of life, suddenly you got a mortgage, you got kids,
Totally.
there's all of those factors that start to come into play for people. But I completely agree with you. I mean, the thing that I've always found fascinating when I've watched companies go through downsizing exercises, often the people that are let go are the people that frankly just ticked all the boxes. The people that tend to stick around are the ones that were continuously adding value, continuously looking for ways to reinvent themselves, continuously. You have to, I don't know, I think it's like you're constantly having to re-engage the relationship you have with your job to keep it fresh and to keep yourself energized, or else you
Yeah.
kind of can put yourself at risk.
Totally. What you're reminding, I actually have in my office at MRG, I have a piece of art, and it's a path, and basically about hiking, and it has three different stages, and it's comfort zone, perceived boundaries, and then after that, comfort zone, perceived boundaries, and then again, comfort zone,
Yeah,
perceived boundaries.
yeah,
And obviously it gets more challenging as it goes through this path, right? And I think that's exactly what the professional journey is all about, right? And how much you
totally.
want to stay in that comfort zone, and then what your perceived boundaries are once you're in that comfort zone.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I've learned, because I've always thrown myself out of my comfort zone, is that when you do that, that's what actually builds you.
Oh, 100%. It's where the most growth happens, no
It's so
question at all.
correlated, right?
Yeah.
Because then you look back and you go, geez, I did that. And then the
Yeah.
next time, the next thing, yeah, it's going to still be daunting, but you know you've walked through the fire before, and you can look back on that and say, see how far I've come, right?
Yes.
So there's a great question in the Q&A from Seth, who says, how do you deal with one of these derailers when they appear? For example, if it's the my way or the highway type leader, and especially if other people don't see it. So what can you do in that situation?
It's a really good question. What I always like to, so for me, transparency always wins the day,
Mm,
right? And whether it's up or down, I'm always a proponent um, of sharing, right? Of let you know, can I can I share with you how I experience you, right? And or how I'm experiencing you with this and why this might be going this way versus that way.
mm,
And I think that transparency can be really helpful. I think also incredibly importantly is you got to take emotion out of it, right?
mm,
Whenever I think about my career and when I've made mistakes or I'm coaching people, very often the biggest things they regret came from an emotional reaction, right? And the
mm,
my way or the highway people very often can evoke an emotional reaction, and that usually isn't helpful, right?
mhm,
And so making sure you watch against that. The last thing I'll just say, so it's not easy. I totally understand that it's not easy.
mhm,
Um, the last thing that I will say is sometimes people who demonstrate these behaviors only respond to these behaviors. So it's
mm,
almost like strength responds to strength in some way.
right.
And if if you're like if they are running over you and you let that happen, it's just going to keep happening. And so um, wherever you can find your backbone, right? And then
Mhm,
I would encourage that in some ways. Um, I'll just share a very quick example. I know that sometimes I can struggle with a backbone for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to bore you with my assessment results to explain that to you. But I've got a really close friend. I've got a really close friend who's the exact opposite of me
mm,
in many ways. And when I know that I'm being treated poorly or this or whatever it might be, I go to him and I explain the situation. And I say, "Hey, how would you handle this? Like, what would
mm,
you do?" And the
mm,
things that come out of his mouth are like they would never even occur to me.
right,
Oh, and what it does is it makes those choice like, oh, that's in the realm of possibility to respond like
right.
that. And it gives me sort of confidence almost in some way to be able to uh, go out of my comfort zone to deal with that situation. And every time I've done it, it's actually gone pretty well, right? And the
Yeah,
world again, if I felt like I was being a jerk, but it actually went just fine,
yeah,
and
yeah,
the
yeah,
world
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
melt, and the relationship didn't erode to nothing, right?
It's so true, and one of the tools we use a lot from MRG is your motivational tool. I'm madly in love. It's called, for those on the call, it's called the Individual Directions Inventory, and it looks at those motivations that sit underneath our behaviors, right? It's
Totally.
that little internal measuring stick that lets you know where do you get juice from and where don't you. And I think what I've really learned from that is so much of this is about perception, what you perceive to be conflict. If you are, low winning, for example, and me with my high winning energy, we're going to have two totally different perceptions of what is conflict, right?
Yeah,
And how that feels to us. And
yeah,
so I think that's one of the things that I think in leadership often we talk a lot about, like, hey, you got to know yourself. I absolutely agree, but the next level up to that is we've got to know each other. Then we've got to understand the collective. And one of the tips I would just share with folks that are maybe struggling with a partner, and we had my friend Michael Bungay Stanier on earlier. He wrote a book earlier this year called How to Work with Almost Anyone. And in that book, what he talks about is this idea of how do you contract with people early on? around how you're going to work together. And that's what I notice we don't do in organizations. We jump into the work relationship. We assume because we all work for the same company, we're all got similar values, we all have similar ways of working. And, one of the tools that we use in our program is it's a stakeholder kind of charter that you create with key partners. And you talk about things like, how do you like to get feedback? How do you like to communicate? How do you like if we would have more of those, slow it down, get the foundation set in the relationship, I think that would also help head things off at the pass. But Michael's book's a good one. I would share everybody on the team, or watch the webinar that I did with Michael earlier in the year, because it's some really great tips on how to also write a relationship that may be going sideways around that. So we have
So
another
Glenn, I just
question.
want
Yeah,
to, I just have a very quick story to kind of crystallize exactly
yeah,
what you're
yeah.
talking about, right? In terms of this, A, contracting, but B, how in a situation like this, it might just be a difference of interpretation.
Yes.
Happened to me a couple of years ago, and this is just such a phenomenal story in many ways in terms of why do people miss, right? So I'm coaching a chief strategy officer for a really big nonprofit here in the States. It's like the most for-profit nonprofit you've ever seen. And he's what I like to call a recovering attorney, which
Right.
means he's an individual that was, I think, Seth, the individual you might work with, very similar, like assertive, competitive. I will bring things to the table and kind of push people around a little bit. He had a CEO who in many ways was the opposite, right? Very kind, supportive, empathetic individual. One day they are in an executive team meeting, and the two of them get into it about a decision that's being made for this organization, right?
Mm,
And apparently things get pretty heated, right,
mm,
for a handful of minutes. And well, things finally calm down. The meeting ends. And a few hours later, the CEO walks down the hallway to the chief strategy officer, the guy I'm coaching, pokes his head in the office and says, "Hey, I want to apologize about earlier. That's not how we do things here. I think in the future, let's just let cooler heads prevail and remain more professional." And the guy I'm coaching kind of looks at him like a confused dog and says, "What are you talking about?" CEO goes,
Gotcha.
"What are you talking? What do you, the executive team meeting earlier where we were yelling at each other?" And the guy I'm coaching says, "Yelling at each other? That
Mm,
wasn't yelling.
yeah,
We're having a good debate about a really big decision this
yeah,
organization is making. I think we solved some things actually. We should be doing that more often."
yeah,
So two people in the same exact situation with two totally different interpretations about what just happened. One, I kind of liked it and I think we should do more of it. The
yeah,
other, embarrassed, like, "Ugh, I
yeah,
can't believe we did that." And I
yeah,
find very often that those type of situations are what's happening when there's conflict. It's just a
yes.
difference of interpretation about what just
Totally
happened.
agree. And totally agree. And if you have a high sensitivity towards something, you are going to pick up more on what's
Totally.
there than maybe is there actually,
Yeah.
right? So interesting. Okay, so we've got another question to answer here. So I love this one. What are some effective ways to collaborate with the engaging lightweight as a peer when leadership do not appear to recognize the engaging lightweight's behavior? Interpret that of like, I've got a peer who's not pulling their weight, and how do I make sure that the people above understand what's going on here? Or
Yes.
maybe that's my interpretation. What would you say to that, Drew?
So, without knowing the entire situation, what I would say is it is important that um, you, as the individual who asked the question potentially, or if you're in that situation, that you're not picking up the slack.
Mm,
So I find that what happens is we teach people how to treat us.
yes.
And if you are the individual who always picks up the loose ends, gets the details, like gets the thing across the finish line, then the engaging lightweight knows you're going to do it,
Mm,
right? And one of the issues with the engaging lightweight is it's not that they can't do it.
mm,
They probably can. It's just that they just don't really want to, right?
mm.
And I don't want to use the word lazy. That's because that's probably not what it is. It's probably something else going on. But um, But I think it's important to make sure you're not doing their job for them in some ways. I will, on the flip side, what I will also say in my experience is trying to draw attention, trying to get senior leadership to see what's going on is very tricky
Mhm.
because it can put you in a light that is not effective for you. Meaning you kind of are you're sort of in this like tattletale mode
Mhm.
that they sort of perceive that as, and then that's not the best light for you to be in. So it's my sort of suggestion is kind of this passive way of dealing with is making sure you're not doing their job for them. And while I understand that that might feel like it negatively impacts you if you're on the same team or the deadline, you're working on the same project, so on and so forth. Um, that is what I've seen work better than just saying, "Hey, hey, hey, this person isn't doing their job." Uh, so that's without knowing any of the sort of the broader circumstances of the situation. It's kind of what I would say. How about you, Glenn?
It's funny because I'm going to use this individual directions inventory. Those of you who know me, my maneuvering energy is off the charts. So that's like I'm always looking at the opportunity and I'm always trying to figure out the way through and that. And what comes to mind for me would be to actually, maybe talk to my boss and say, hey, I need some coaching and mentoring. I've got this peer. This is what I'm struggling with. Can you help me sort of, this is what I've tried. Like you have to legitimately tried some things. But sometimes I think building some allies around other people around the situation, it's a political play, and if you don't have a lot of energy for political maneuvers, you might not want to do things like that. But I think that there is sometimes like if it's legitimately, getting in the way and getting in the way of you being able to deliver on things, that's a different approach. You're not tattletaling, you're actually going leadership and support on how might they do it. But what you're also doing in that moment is you are maybe shining a bit of a light on some of the challenges you're experiencing. So
Sure.
I think politics, we talked about that actually on the pre-call too, right? The underestimation of when things start to shift for you in organizations where your ability to kind of manage around and this influence and informal influence and do that starts to become more important than your positional power, right?
Absolutely.
What do you think of that?
Yeah. So I think so I totally agree with you, by the way. A quick comment. The other thing I would just say to that question is, have you talked to the person?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
sometimes
yeah.
find that people like haven't even had the conversation
Mhm,
with the
mhm.
individual that about what's happening, right?
Great point. Like, yeah, we're
Right.
making the assumption that you've already tried to kind of
Yeah,
work this
yeah.
together for sure.
Um, in terms of navigating politics, so as I was going through sort of our pre-notes, I wrote something along the lines of just how tricky politics are, but also getting too wrapped up in them is I detrimental for people in a couple of ways.
Mhm.
They spend too much time thinking about it, right?
Yes.
And getting and too much time thinking about it versus just trying to focus on the work.
Yeah.
And the other thing here is, as a leader, as a leader, you got to be really cautious about what you say about other people. Because, I'm in a situation right now where I'm coaching an individual and the person just has a really difficult time keeping their mouths shut about what they think about other people in the organization. And it's
Right.
not doing them any favors.
Right.
And they think they're playing the political game, but they're
No.
not,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
All they're doing is damaging their own reputation.
Yeah.
And what I find is that leaders continually underestimate the shadows that they cast and
Yeah.
how many people are paying attention to them,
Yeah.
right? You don't underestimate how many people are watching you and the decisions you make and how you talk about it. And just think about your career, right?
Yeah.
When you were 30 and there was a VP in the room watching that person,
Yeah.
right? And I think people somehow like they forget at some level.
Yeah.
Um, and so while yes, navigating politics is and sort of the informal influence I think is critical, doing it too overtly I think gets you into trouble, right? Or, sort of engaging in it too, where it's so obvious and making
Mhm.
comments about, excuse me, about people or whatever it might be is just, yeah, I think it's sort of career suicide in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think people who say there's no politics in our organization, I think that's a naive response. There's always some sort of
100% is
thing
a naive
going
response.
on.
Yes.
And but it's like politics can be negative or they can be helpful in terms of moving things forward. But it's that fine line. And I think what you're talking about too, I also think about, again, I'm going to go back to motivation a lot because I just think it's so fascinating. What I notice with some of the people that I coach that have that sort of a need to sort of express their opinions about everybody and everything. It's often they're very relational. And I almost feel sometimes like what they're trying to do is build a relationship with you by sharing what they think is going on with other people. And they don't see how
Totally.
that's backfiring. It's almost that's their go-to way of building trust and let me share with you what did you think about that meeting and this is what I thought. Da, 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 da. And that's where, it's funny because to your point about like the shadows that we cast are always attached to a strength that we have, right? So
Sure.
where those relational skills might be serving you really well in one area, they're not going to be so great when it comes to, using potentially office gossip to further, try and get in with certain people, right? So, yeah, it's interesting because that is definitely that low restraint,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been known to struggle with it. Let's put it that way, Glenn.
Oh, oh, totally. I mean, because I mean, I'm the highly relational person, and I think sometimes, that's the way I think, and especially early on in my career, I would do that. And then somebody said to me, like if you're saying this to me, what are you saying about me to other people, right? And so, and I think sometimes too, depending on how you process stuff, sometimes you need to talk things out to really understand what it is that you're struggling with, which is fine, which is where having a coach can really help, but also have that sounding board that is your neutral sounding board that is going to, be supportive in that way, right? Versus being willy-nilly about who you talk to people about things,
Totally.
right? Okay, so we've got another great question for Seth, and this was actually one of my questions. So Seth, you must be reading ahead in my questions, but let's get to it. You know, uh, if you were going to advise folks to double down on a specific behavior or a couple behaviors coming up, given everything that's going on in the world and what you're seeing trends wise, um, are there any sort of key leadership behaviors that you're like, you know what? You
Yep.
can't go wrong if you double down on these right now. What would you
Yes.
say to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. The two big ones for me are I'm going to call it initiative and I'm going to call it broader thinking.
Mm,
And what do I mean by that? Well, so in my experience, executives love people who take initiative. Yes, take initiative within the bounds of which they can do it. But whenever I think about leaders I coach and them sort of complaining about people underneath them, what are they? One of the big things they're complaining about? It's like no one takes initiative. No one
yeah.
anticipates like what's the
Totally.
obvious next step, right? And they're always just waiting for me to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
Leaders complain about that, or executives complain about that all the time,
Yeah.
right? So if you are an individual who sort of can anticipate, just use your intelligence. Like if I make this decision, clearly that is probably this,
Yeah.
right? And sort of take the initiative to make that happen or finish the thing, whatever the heck it is. And it's just kind of go that extra mile without being told that that's what you need to do. Yes, there are bounds to it, like I just mentioned, and maybe you should check in, but in my experience, leaders and executives love this. And if you're smart, like you can see what's coming, just connect the
Mm,
dots.
mm.
The other thing I would just say here in terms of broader thinking is um, recognizing the ripple effects of your decision making.
Oh, huge.
So, what I notice about people as you move through your career is, when you're younger, individual contributor, even when you are a new leader, first line leader, your world is it's a little smaller. right? And if you make a decision then that maybe isn't the best one, like the ripple effects don't go very far.
Mhm.
But as you progress, your world gets bigger. And what I find is that people don't recognize that their world gets bigger until they make a decision that maybe wasn't a great one. And then they find out like it impacted that person over in the other department and it was the wrong thing. And I didn't even think about that. And
Yeah,
then it's like this wake up moment of like, oh, I didn't even see that that was right. It's you're sort of
yeah,
you're so in isolation because that's how we are, when you're in
yeah,
school and the early career, like you don't have to think about the bigger picture because
yeah,
it's not really relevant.
yeah.
But as your career progresses, your world gets bigger, and your decisions will have the ripple effects go wider. And you have to think about where is this going to go? Who is this going to touch? How will it impact them? And try and get ahead of it, or make sure that the um, recognize that the decision might impact that person or that group
Hmm.
and check in with them, right?
Hmm.
And is this okay? Why would you do it differently? So on and so forth. So those are the two big ones where there's no the downside feels less to me. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way.
And you know what? I completely agree with you. I mean, I have some thoughts about this whole leaders who say my team don't take initiative, because my question is, so what part of this do you own? Because why aren't they taking
Yeah,
initiative, right?
totally.
So there's
Yeah,
always a place to look there. Like if you've taken initiative and your boss has come down on you like a ton of bricks, why would you want to take more initiative, right? So there's a piece, I think, and all of us who are on the call that are leaders, you need to, if you're find yourself saying, why the team taking initiative? Why aren't they running with things? I'm constantly doing that. My team who's on this call, they could probably put in the chat, yep, Glain is constantly getting in our way and giving us too much advice and too many opinions, which creates a bottleneck, right? Like it pulls it back. So you gotta you've got to be really clear as a leader. What are the roles? What are the expectations you have of other people? What are the decision-making boundaries? If you're not clear on that, how can people take initiative if you're not putting some guides around that? There's a piece of that for all of us that lead teams to really make sure that we're not not disabling our teams from taking initiative. But
sure.
this piece about, broad thinking, I think that's so true. And you know what I hear often with my clients is they're told they need to be more strategic. You need to
Yeah,
be more strategic. But when you really dig into what that means, what senior leaders are saying is you need to have a broader view of the business, because you're off doing this over here and you have no clue how that's impacting that department. And
100%.
so the amount of time that you could invest next year, if you're all thinking about what's my plan for next year, get to know your peers and understand how you intersect with them and
Yep.
start to look for ways that you can be more collaborative. This is where leadership is going, right? We're in a system here. Things don't work in isolation. And I think if you've got a boss saying, I need you to be more strategic, dig a little. It might be about that. That might be the linchpin thing that you need to think about.
I totally agree with you. That's very often when I hear that word, that's what it's about. No question at all.
Yeah, you dig into it. It's like you need people. Okay, so I want to talk about bosses. I know we're coming up on time here, but this is another thing that I think people's careers get stalled by. They're doing great. Their boss loves them. They're getting great performance reviews. Things are going wonderfully well for them on a career trajectory. Then they get a new boss. And all
Yeah.
of a sudden, things aren't going so well. New boss isn't like the old boss. I mean, this can be inevitable. It can also happen where you go from a company where you were a superstar and you decide to make a career move and you land somewhere else. The culture is different, the things are different, their expectations are different. So all this, I think, is kind of an inevitable part of kind of managing your career. What would you say to help people kind of combat these sorts of inevitabilities?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And what I would say, so the highlight for me here is it's somewhat about mindset.
Mm,
And this is why organizations love people, agile is the word that, gets used
right.
all the time
Such
now,
another big
right?
word.
Right. Or adaptability, right?
Yes.
And this is a perfect situation that where this matters, right? A ton. And what I
Mm.
always and but what I find is that people's mindset about it is negative. And I find that people's mindset about change in general is negative,
Mm.
which to my point, to what I always tell people is, okay, let's get like just think about your life and how much change you have endured over the course of your lifetime, right? And how you're still here, you're still
Mhm.
doing just fine,
Mhm.
right? Like people seem to underestimate their I find people underestimate their ability to adapt.
Yes, agree.
Continually underestimate their ability to
Agree.
adapt, and because change is sort of scary in some way.
Yeah.
So if you can flip this mindset of it's dreadful to what's the opportunity here? So I always think the phrase I love is never let a crisis go to waste,
Right.
right? And a few things come to mind here where there's no, I'm sure there were things about your previous boss that were not, I promise. I'm sure there were some patterns of behavior that you didn't love. And this is what I love about this is this really is a blank slate opportunity for you to be intentional, our
Mhm.
favorite word, about, all right, what do I like? What habits do I want to create? What relationship patterns do I want to create with this new leader?
Yeah.
I learned this, and this, and this over the course of my career. How do I make sure that I set this up sort of appropriately? Because what I do find is that relationship patterns get built very quickly, and
Yeah.
once they're in place, they're very hard to break.
Yeah.
So what's nice about a new boss is it's a little bit of a blank slate,
Yeah.
right? And I guarantee you there's opportunity there versus just being, terrified that you just lost lost your boss that you worked great with and so on and so forth. So
Mhm.
for me, this is really a lot about mindset and the faith or the confidence that no, you can do it. You have the adaptability to do it and to make it work. That's what I would say.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think what I've learned too, and part of our process is always we sort of will align a coachee in our programs with their boss, right? To have we use the 22 behaviors from MRG as an anchoring point to talk about behavioral expectations, right? Because often bosses don't articulate that well. And when we go back to that what and that how,
Yeah.
that's where helping if you don't know really what your boss expects around how you're going to do the job, using something like that, like a neutral thing, if you've got core values, if you've got competencies in your organization, sit down and just say, so what are most important to you around these things, right? What are the things that you're going to be looking for? If I've done a stellar job, what are we celebrating 12 months from now? Those sorts of questions can really help you unpack the mindset your boss has and what they're going to be looking for and paying attention to. And
Right.
I don't know, in my experience, when it comes to shifting behavior, often it's not as big as you think. Often it's like tweaks.
Totally. It's fun. Yes, one of my final notes here is like you should had parting words of advice,
Yeah.
and my two were there's no perfect leader, and the
Yeah.
second one is uh, recognize that very small shifts in behavior can have a really big impact. Right? When I'm
Huge.
coaching people, I'm not trying to change who they are as a person. It's like it's 3 degrees to the left,
Yeah.
right? And it can make a huge difference. So I
Amazing.
totally agree with that perspective, Glenn.
Amazing. Well,
Yeah.
Drew, I can't believe this hour is gone. Thank you so much for being with us today. It has been an absolute pleasure. And I will take us home. So let me actually, Kenzie, can you stop screen sharing? And I'm going to just share from my side. It's a little
Mhm.
easier for me. Thank you. Here we go. So I just want to let everybody know who's on the call. If you are curious about some of the tools that Drew and I have talked about, if you want to do your own personal leadership plan, get set up for 2025, or you're interested in what are my motivations that are maybe driving some of my behaviors, because I do see that can derail people. We didn't even get to talk about that. We'll give you a discount. Reach out to Leanne if you're interested in learning more about that. And then just a couple of notes about what's coming up. We've got my Peter Aceto, View from the C-Suite. We're actually going to be talking about bold career moves with Peter. Peter was the CEO of Tangerine Bank, went into the cannabis industry. If you Google him, you will see what happened to him when he made that big career move. So we're going to talk about some lessons learned around that. I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. We're going to do that November 20th. And then I want you all to save the date. We are having a roundtable reunion. November 28th, 5:30 to 8, Sweat and Tonic, Young and Shooter. Invitations are going out next week. We would love to see you. It's been a long time. So thanks everybody for being here today. Enjoy the rest of your week, what's left of it. And thanks for the great questions. Great having you all here.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.